Welcome back, everyone. An organization called Fair Count is closely monitoring the 2020 census numbers, led by former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams. Fair Count works to build long-term power in communities that are historically undercounted in the census, underrepresented at the polls, and whose communities are often torn apart by redistricting. Rebecca DeHart is the CEO of Fair Count, and she joins us now live from Atlanta to break down the numbers. Thanks for being with us, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Laverne. I'm happy to be here.
Glad to have you. Well, the numbers are in. What do you make of the census count, and what do you think we learned from the census count report?
Yeah, the 2020 census will live in infamy, just like the year 2020. It had so many challenges, not just from the pandemic, but from an administration that was not supportive of a fair and accurate count and that actually worked to cull people, particularly immigrants and undocumented persons from the count. We dealt with historic natural disasters, from the wildfires in California to the strongest hurricane season on record in the Southeast. And so we knew that this count had sort of faced everything. Yesterday, when we saw the seats come out, I think probably the big bombshell was New York. It was stated in the Census Bureau's press conference that New York lost one congressional seat, and that had New York counted 89 more people in the census, they would not have lost that seat. Minnesota would have. So it was really, it really struck home with how important it is to get counted in the census and how every single person really does matter.
That sounds bogus. Can we get a recount?
It's pretty incredible, isn't it?
I'm not even joking. It sounds like I'm joking, but like seriously.
Sometimes those margins are slim. We know our share of slim margins here in Georgia, and it was pretty astounding.
89 people?
Yeah.
But why does it always seem so shady? You know, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but you know, when people hear this, it sounds shady.
Well, it's interesting, too, because a lot of people believed that New York could potentially lose 2 congressional seats. And so to have them just lose 1. And in fact, many people thought that Texas would actually gain 3 seats and that Florida might have gained 2. And so, you know, there were some surprises yesterday. I think, you know, a big takeaway, and being a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works for that fair count, we spend a lot of time with the Census Bureau. And we know that the folks that are at the Census Bureau right now are working overtime and working diligently to get the most accurate count possible with the data that they have. And so I think it's going to take, you know, a couple of years really to kind of suss out exactly what the effects of all of those impactful events were. And we actually won't know until the spring or summer of 2022 about exactly who was undercounted and by how much.
That is really, really troubling. So are you saying then that we don't have much information on communities of color specifically and how they were counted, if they were counted in the numbers that one would expect?
That's right. So we knew a little bit going into it. The census is broken up into 2 periods. There's the self-response period where, you know, a lot of us got little cards in the mail that let us go online, you know, or we called in our census. But for people who did not do that, they enter a period called the non-response follow-up period. Typically, that's a period that it lasts about 3 months, but it was completely just destroyed by the pandemic. And of course, we didn't end the census until October. And in the end of July, when we were going into the non-response follow-up period, we knew that Latinx communities were trailing white census tracts, like census tracts that were primarily Latinx, were trailing primarily white census tracts by 11%. Black census tracts were trailing white census tracts by about 14%, and Native communities by about 25%. So we knew that NARFU period was all important, and there was a lot of advocacy on the ground because many people in power wanted to shut it down, to keep it going as long as possible, to get as many people counted as possible. The numbers that we got yesterday for apportionment were just simply population counts. Kind of, this is how many people live in the state, this is how many seats you get. We actually won't know the demographic counts until the redistricting files are released coming this fall. They have to be released by September 30th, and then we'll get to know a lot about what happened.
So, Rebecca, this is just raising more and more questions. The more and more information you give us, the more questions are coming up. who's in charge of this? How can we find out if there is a way? I mean, is it possible to get a recount? Is it possible to get a do-over because of COVID and everything else? Who is in charge of all this? How does it work? And is there a process to make sure that indeed things did happen correctly and fairly? Because as you said, we had challenges from COVID on down.
That's right. Well, those are the big questions of the day for sure. Um, so undercounts are inevitable. They always tend to happen, and we know in the advocacy world that there are particular communities of color, people with disabilities, people experiencing poverty, people in very rural areas are undercounted every census. And in fact, in the last census, white homeowners were overcounted. So there's a lot of work to do in the advocacy world, and that's what Fair Count really tries to do, is put as much emphasis on the census as we do on voting and elections, because it really is sort of the epicenter of our democracy, of which everything is based on. More than $1 trillion annually are given out to the states and communities based on census responses. Our lines for redistricting are drawn because of that. And so we do everything that we can to try and ensure the best count we can. In Georgia, we actually did a little bit better with our self-response rate than we did in 2010, and we're really proud of that. We were only 3 of southern states that actually did a little better in that self-response rate, and that's really the key data that is sort of the gold standard for the data for the census. Going forward, if problems are revealed, and some were, there was a lot of issues with college students because they left right around Census Day and they had to go back, and where they counted at home or where they counted at the dorm. The Census Bureau has just worked overtime to really try and find those anomalies and solve them. But we won't really know the full outcome for the next couple of years. After we get the post-enumeration survey, which will tell us how much communities were undercounted by in 2022, there are some processes out there for cities, municipalities, et cetera, to ask for a recount. They're arduous. It's my understanding that those cities and municipalities would actually have to foot the bill for the recount, and that those recounts actually would not affect redistricting for political lines, would only change the sort of algorithm that for the federal resources that they would receive going forward. It's very rare. The United States Constitution does allow for another census 5 years after the decennial census. However, again, very rare. It would have to be approved by Congress, and the census costs about $16 billion to administer. So it would be a big decision for policymakers.
Rebecca, you've given us a lot of interesting information, and like I said, it's actually raised more questions than ever, but you said some key takeaways. We've got minorities undercounted, white homeowners overcounted. We don't know the effects for a couple of years, although we can kind of guess. And we're also talking about congressional seats that are redistricting in New York by 89 people. So again, we're out of time. We'll have to bring you back another time, but this certainly seems very concerning for Americans as a whole, to make sure this country is treated fairly. But thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Laverne.